Good morning, everybody. It's good to be here with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Office of Emergency Management. I'm not going to read all this to you, but really the key points here are when we have a disaster or any other or kind of an emergency, and there's a difference between the two. We can have an emergency without a disaster because in an emergency we're leaning forward and getting ready to do a response to a disaster. For example, we had on March 3rd and 4th, extremely critical weather day for fire hazards. So we actually activated our Emergency Operations Center for that. That's an emergency type situation. Now, if we had the wildfire, now we have a disaster we're dealing with. But we really operate in similar ways, whether it's an emergency or a disaster. And the main things that we're looking at are resources and responsibilities, because when you have a disaster or an emergency, things get very complicated very quickly. And so we have a nomenclature that we use, the language that we use, the forms that we use, everything in emergency management across the United States is the same. So I could send my staff to California to a wildfire, and they could walk into the room and immediately start to work because we use the same forms, the same language. And so it's really nice to have that kind of those underpinnings common across the United States. The four big components of emergency management are preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. I'll go into a little more detail on each one of those in a moment, but our overall goals are really threefold. Morbidity, mortality, we need to be sure that we're reducing the impact on human health of the emergency or disaster, minimize property damage, and protect the environment. So that's really our big three goals in everything that we're doing. The principles of emergency management, all emergency management begins and ends locally. There are a lot of misleading things that you'll see in movies, like that FEMA shows up, and now FEMA's not in charge of anything. They never are. And so what happens, especially under Chapter 418 Texas Code, so under our state law, the person in charge of a disaster is the most senior elected official. So in Williamson County, it's Judge Snell right now. Okay, so if we have a disaster in the county, Judge Snell is in charge. Now, if it's in a city, the mayor of that city is in charge. And then if the city gets overwhelmed, they reach out to the county. If the county gets overwhelmed or can't meet those needs, we reach out to the state. And if the state doesn't have what we need, then they reach out to the feds. So that's kind of the flow of things. So we may or may not engage the state or may not engage the feds, depending on the scope of a disaster. Types of disaster assistance include several things. I'm going to talk primarily about two, and these are the two that you see or hear the most about after disasters. You hear about a federal declaration for a disaster, right? That federal declaration is not based on the impact on people's homes and property. It's based on the impact on the overall infrastructure. So it's roads, it's bridges, it's dams, it's utilities, it's parks, it's government buildings. So when you look at the public assets, that's what's used to do the calculation. Right now, the threshold for declaring a disaster in the state of Texas is $55 million of public property being damaged. Now, I'll get to the private property in a moment, but it's $55 million of uninsured loss of public property. So, and that's, by the way, based on the Consumer Price Index of $1.89 times the population of the state. And then the county threshold has a different calculation, and it's a CPI of $4.72 per person, times the population. And why do I mention this? Well, there are folks who look at a disaster and it's like, well, they didn't declare a disaster because the governor is of a different party, or that's a really conservative area and the president's liberal, or that's a really liberal area and the president's conservative. They didn't declare a disaster because of politics. That never happens. It's based on simple math. We go out and do a damage assessment, and based on the impact on public property, we can determine whether or not we meet that threshold for a disaster. So for the state, it's $55 million. For Williamson County, to be part of that disaster, it's $2.9 million of public property. Now let's talk about individual assistance. This is what happens when we have an impact on a community, and FEMA shows up, and you'll see they set up what they call DRCs, Disaster Recovery Centers. And people can go to the Disaster Recovery Center and say, here are my woes. I'm having the worst day of my life right now, and here's what I need. And there's a variety of products that FEMA can offer. And so it includes, we can do mass care, crisis counseling, unemployment assistance, legal services, case management. Also, they have this individuals and households program, so they can actually pay for some repairs of a home just to make the home safe. In other words, if you get water in your home and it doesn't make it up to the outlets, by the way, that's the big trigger as far as whether you have minor or major damage in a home after flooding. If it makes it up to the electrical outlets, it's major damage. If it stays below them, it's more minor. But what FEMA can do is they'll fund the removal of the drywall of the area that's flooded, and the removal of the carpeting and everything, basically to make your home safe enough for you to go back in and stay in your home while you do the recovery. So that's what that program is about. They also, you hear about the FEMA trailers, and they also have some pretty nice RVs now as well. So they also have RVs and trailers and things, and then they do hotel vouchers in addition to that. So when your home is impacted, if you don't have anywhere to go, you could be eligible for getting an RV parked in front of your house while repairs are going on in your home, or that you'll be put up in a hotel with a voucher, or that you'll be put up in a FEMA trailer, which we set up these large trailer parks and with all the FEMA trailers. And by the way, I was the deputy director for Hurricane Harvey recovery for FEMA, so I was with FEMA before I came to the county. And so those are the kinds of things that people can get. That's a different kind of disaster declaration, by the way. Individual assistance is a separate declaration. It's not based on that $55 million. They look a lot more kind of subjectively of what kind of population is impacted. Are they really well-to-do? Are they really well insured? And if it turns out it's people who, you look at like in the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of storm damage that they had, a lot of those folks had nowhere to go. They had no resources to take care of themselves. That immediately warrants an IA declaration so that they can go in and start doing things for those people. So that's just two of the ways that declarations work. There's other kinds as well. There's an SBA declaration, Small Business Administration, where they open up low-interest loans. There's even a USDA declaration, where the USDA will declare a disaster and offer low-interest loans to farmers. So a disaster declaration is not just a disaster declaration. There's all kinds of different flavors of those that do different things for different people. And then, of course, we also have the non-FEMA assistance. That's really where you get the most help after a disaster. That's the non-governmental folks. By the way, one of the greatest partners we have is HEB. They are awesome. At just about every disaster that I've ever been to in the 15 years or so that I've been working in the state of Texas in disasters, just about every one, they get there about the same time I do, and they feed people, they take care of people. By the way, if we have a need in the county, like we had a water issue in Florence, I called up HEB and said, hey, can we get a pallet of water for Florence? They said, yeah, come on and get it. And they just give it to us. So HEB is an outstanding partner. There's others too, but HEB is one that especially has really great support for us. The kinds of disaster declarations we've seen over the past 50 years, this is kind of a breakdown of all the federal disaster. Now, we've had a whole lot more disasters than this, okay? But the federal, that hit that threshold and trigger that federal aid, 8 of them have been big wildfires. There's 4 that are in this other category. That includes things like COVID. That was a declared disaster as well. And then we have the series of storms, like severe storms, hurricanes. And folks sometimes say, well, we don't get hit with hurricanes. Well, actually, we do. We have remnants of a hurricane that can kind of work its way up to central Texas. And unfortunately, every once in a while, we'll get remnants of a hurricane that'll come up and stall right over central Texas. And that's where we've seen some of the worst flooding in our county's history. There's those kinds of scenarios. Of course, we've experienced some winter storms over the past several years with Uri and Mara. But here is the worst disaster in our county's history was in 1921, and it was that scenario I just described. It was when we had remnants of a hurricane that spun up into central Texas and stalled out literally right over Taylor and Thrall. So you just had this huge collection of thunderstorms that just rotated and stayed right there over that area and dropped 39 inches of rain in 36 hours. So a total of 93 people drowned in the county. 87 of those people were in Taylor and Thrall. And this is 1921, so you can imagine the population there was really small. And yet 87 people drowned in that area. That storm also went on to move its way back down over San Antonio, and it flooded the streets of San Antonio. where there were boats going down the street, and I'm not talking the Riverwalk. I'm talking boats on the main streets up near the Alamo. There were boats in the roads. So this was the worst disaster we've ever had in our county's history. Second worst was more recent, and that was the 1997 tornadoes, and particularly the F5 tornado that hit Gerald. 27 fatalities, and this was a monster. And what it consisted of was, you can see that this map up here at the top right. There were a total of 20 tornadoes from San Antonio to Waco along the storm system, and they always seem to kind of form right around like 35. Just the way the weather patterns come off the hill country, we have tornadoes that form along 35, and so that's exactly what happened here. Right down the 35 corridor, 20 tornadoes. The biggest of which was the F5 that hit Gerald. Killed 27 people, 300 cattle. It scoured the soil 18 to 24 inches. You know what that means? That means that tornado dug into the ground. And 18 to 24 inches, it dug a trench. This was a monster. And so that is actually possible in our county, but it's really rare. I mean, over 100 years, this is the only one that we've had that was this severe, an F5 like this. Now it's more common to have an F1, F2, smaller ones. And so it begs the question, I came from Missouri, I grew up in St. Louis, everybody has a basement. So we don't have basements here, at least most people don't. So what do you do? What are you going to do if there's a tornado bearing down on your property? The rule of thumb is you put as many walls in between you and the storm as possible. So if it's an interior restroom, if it's an interior closet, you put as many walls in between you. And by the way, I saw this with the Round Rock tornado. I was responding after that. Pulled up to a house that was one of the worst, as far as the damage to the homes, one of the worst hit homes of that whole tornado. And it was all the walls, outer walls and the roof were gone. There was just some framing left in the center. And there was a gentleman digging through the rubble, and I walked over. I said, "Are you okay? How are things going?" He said, "Yeah, actually, I wasn't home. My girlfriend was, though. Good thing she went in the bathroom, because she was in the living room. The living room's gone. Actually, the car from the garage was sitting in the living room. But she survived because she went to that innermost room." Okay, so that's really the key thing to keep in mind. If you ever hear of a tornado warning and you need to take cover, as many walls as possible between you and the storm on the lowest floor. See, if you have a second story, don't stay there. Lowest floor in the center, okay? Mitigation, preparedness, response and recovery, these are the four pillars of what we do in emergency management. We do things to mitigate, which those are the things we do before a disaster to reduce the impact of the disaster on people and property. So it's, floodgates, it's drainage projects, it's tornado sirens, it's gates to shut off low water crossings when there's flooding. It's those things that you do to reduce the impact before a disaster occurs are the things that we do in mitigation. And we're trying to do more of these kinds of projects these days as well across Williamson County. We typically pursue federal funds for these. FEMA has money available that they'll pay 75%, we pay 25%. So we've already got several projects underway right now that are funded by FEMA doing these kinds of things. Or actually, applications I put in to request the funding to do some of these kinds of things. In preparedness, this is the planning, training, and exercise. So we do our risk assessments, we figure out what's the universe of risks that we have, and we'll rank them. What's going to have the worst impact, so what do we need to really focus on to help people the most? And then we do planning around those things. We do training on the plan. So we do the plan, we train on the plan, then we do exercises. We take the lessons learned from the exercises, we go back and revise our plan. And then we train on it, we exercise it, and that process continues until there's a disaster. Then we get together and say, what can we do better? We go back and revise the plan, we train on it, we exercise it. And that's kind of how preparedness works, kind of in general. But it also includes a lot of other things like public awareness campaigns. And thank you all for being here, for taking an interest in your community and engaging in this is really, really valuable. It's good for us also to have FaceTime with you all. Response, as I mentioned before, we have kind of a common nomenclature, common forms, common processes and procedures that we use across the United States. So if someone from FEMA or TDM, from the state or the feds or from another county or city comes into our area to help us out, we're all speaking the same language and know how things get done. We've also had a number of EOC, Emergency Operations Center activations. Our EOC is down the road a couple miles on the right, down behind the animal shelter. And It's a room that we set up kind of a little bit smaller than this, but we've got tables that are set up that are marked with kind of who sits where. And when we have a disaster, then we figure out who do we need to work with most closely during this disaster. Do we need road and bridge? Do we need facilities? Who all do we need in the room? Sheriff's office, public health. And so we staff it up according to the kind of disaster we're dealing with. And then, of course, we have our common processes that we use then to deal with things. And so right now, our EOC activation level is level 4. We're under normal conditions. We may go to level 3 tonight or tomorrow because we're starting to lean forward already, looking at the weather. And if it looks like we're starting to get watches and warnings in our county, we can pretty quickly go to level 3 where all of our staff are, actively engaged, watching everything that's going on. And if necessary, then we start calling people into the Emergency Operations Center. And it goes from there all the way up to level 1, which is all hands on deck. All the tables are full and we're working. And some of the things that we've activated for, 2018 Taylor, Texas floods, the Cedar Park fire in 23 that took out an apartment building, the Round Rock tornadoes that I just mentioned a moment ago in 2022. Those are a few things that we activated our Emergency Operations Center for, but we also did it for Election Day. Just to be sure that we were monitoring if anything happened and a polling place went down, that we could quickly step in and make sure that we could set something up as an alternative and get people moving in the right way so we didn't have any hiccups in the election process. So we can manage big events just like we manage disasters. Of course, the recovery, and I mentioned already kind of the public assistance, individual assistance, and some of the not-for-profits that are involved in this. But the main thing is, first of all, taking care of lives, and then property, and then also protecting the environment as far as the recovery goes. You probably heard about this or seen this. The 3 things you need to do to get prepared. You need to encourage your family to do this, your neighbors to do this. You build a kit, you make a plan, you stay informed. Those are the 3 big things that everybody needs to do, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these. First of all, build a kit. And there's information on this, by the way. I think I had that on, well, I got it coming up. But there's a Texas Ready website that you can go to that gives you all the details. Essentially, though, there's food and water, all the essentials that you would need. Like consider what would happen if the electricity went off. Do you have a flashlight? Do you have batteries? Do you have like a separate little brick to charge your cell phone, like a separate battery for your cell phone to charge it? Those are the kinds of things that you can put into your kit. And I always get the question, well, you hear about how much food and water should you have? Because some of the recommendations say you should be independent for 72 hours. Have food and water for everyone in your household for 72 hours. That's a really great place to start, but you should try to get more than that. At least go for about a week, because we've even seen in recent history in this county with the winter storms where we saw nearly a solid week where a lot of people were out of power, and in some cases power and water. So at least a week. I was on a discussion panel. I was at a conference in New York City, and I got seated on a panel for a discussion next to Ted Koppel. You all know, everybody who's nodding their head yes is older, right? Ted Koppel, he was huge back in the 80s and somewhat in the 90s. Brilliant journalist. He did an investigative journalist piece, actually wrote a book called Lights Out, looking at the power grid of the United States and how vulnerable it is. And if it goes down, how long it could be down. And so we had this, and I was talking about pandemics. This is years ago before COVID. And so we were talking about thinking the unthinkable was the theme, and we all talked about different things that could happen that could have a huge impact. And it was for police chiefs from around the country. And after it was over, Ted Koppel and I went to dinner. It was really exciting because I grew up watching this guy, on TV. And so I'm sitting across the table from him at dinner, and I said, hey, Ted, how prepared are you? I mean, you just did this book saying the power grid could be out for months. What do you have in your home? He said, I've got a 6-month supply of food and water for my wife and me. He said, and after doing this book, I'm going to take it to a year. And by the way, there are some people that do that. In fact, any Mormons in the room can tell you, in the Mormon faith, many of them will prepare a year, have a year of food and water to help not only themselves, but to help their neighbors in the event that something really catastrophic goes on. So it's actually it's ingrained in their faith. So there are people who prepare for 6 months or a year. I recommend at least doing a week, okay? Making a plan, just understanding, where you're going to go and who you're going to contact. If you have to leave your house, is there someone nearby in a surrounding county that you can go stay with if your house is directly impacted? Also, who are you going to contact, and how are you going to contact them? So in a lot of cases, we'll recommend too that have all of the folks in your family identify someone out of state that you can all call, because sometimes all the lines are down locally, and it's hard to get a call from like here to Round Rock. But if you call from here to Dallas, you'll get the call through. So have somebody out of town that everyone can call. So have that kind of planning done, where you're going to go and how you're going to communicate. And also don't forget your pets and animals. That's become a big deal in every disaster that we deal with. And God bless them, a lot of pet owners, helicopters come in to pull them off the roof of their house. And this happened during Hurricane Katrina, where they said, leave your dog and get on the little, we're going to rescue you. And it's like, no, I'm not going unless my dog's going. So make sure that you have a plan for your pets. And by the way, we have plans in place in our county to take care of people and to take care of pets, okay? And also stay informed. One way that you can do that is this Warren Central Texas. And then also, if you have any vulnerabilities, like any mobility issues, any particular health issues that could impact how quickly you could respond and take care of yourself during a disaster, we would encourage you to register in the STEER program. I'll touch briefly on both of these. First of all, Warren Central Texas. This is a program that you can put on your phone. You register and tell it whether you want phone calls or text, however you would like to get information, and it will start lighting up when we start getting storms and things, okay? So make sure that you sign up for that, and that way you don't have to be glued to your TV to get warnings and stuff, okay? It'll come right to your phone. And real quick, the difference between watching a warning, that's one of my favorite examples. It's like a taco. This is a taco watch. All of the elements exist to make a taco. We don't have a taco yet, but all the elements are there. This is a taco warning. That means it's all come together and we got us a taco. So if you hear there's a tornado watch, that means everything's in place. It could happen. If you hear there's a tornado warning, we have rotation in a cloud and you need to take cover. Okay? And then finally, the STEER program, real quick on that. Anybody who has any kind of susceptibility, whether it's mobility, health issues, whatever it may be, we encourage them to register, and then what that does is it gives us a list. It's a confidential list, and following a disaster, this is our priority. We look who's on the STEER list. Those are the people that are the most vulnerable, who've signed up to be checked on. Now, it doesn't guarantee you're going to get a knock on your door and someone checking up on you, but it means you're a priority for us. And if you register for STEER, we're going to call you and say, hey, are you okay? And a lot of this is people who have durable medical equipment, people who have O2 tanks and things like that. Do you have everything that you need? If not, we're going to help you get it. So I would encourage you all to register for STEER. If you have any of those vulnerabilities, or if you know someone who does, encourage them to register for STEER. And again, that puts them on the list for us to follow up if we have like a power outage for a significant period of time or anything like that. Okay, and that's it. And I'll turn it back over to Connie. Do I have time for questions? Okay, yes, sir.
How do all of these registration sites that you mentioned and that others have mentioned, how does Smart 911 fit into that?
Those two things aren't connected at this point. Like the Smart 911 and the STEER program. The STEER program is simply, and you can call 211 and register for it. It just basically puts you on a registry, on a list that we refer back to. Now, it doesn't have any connection with 911, so that's a whole separate thing. Of course, if you have any issues, then you need to call 911. But if you don't call 911, you may get a call from us saying, if you're on STEER, saying, are you okay? All right? Yes, ma'am.
Right after the Gerald, not right after, but just a few years after the Gerald tornado, we started building our home just east of I-35, just a little bit south of Gerald. And because of that fear, we decided to put in a storm shelter. I grew up visiting all my relatives in middle central Kansas. And so I was used to, we only had one family that actually had a true cellar. Everybody else had dugouts. We had big, heavy doors that went over them. The storm cellar we wound up with, I think it's a sheet of steel, but it's very flimsy. And I have never felt good about that. And I was wondering what your comments were about if you do have something, what do you do, or how necessary is it to have a sturdy covering for
Well,
the entry to that space?
That's a good question. And there are specifications that are on FEMA's website, and they lay out, they've had engineers study all of that, and they lay out, if you want to establish a shelter, here's how you need to build it, here's what kind of doors or covering that it needs to have. So there are some specific details that are really helpful that are on FEMA's website that you can look up. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
What was the trigger, like last night, the Williamson County thunderstorm warning?
Mm-hmm.
What initiated that? Who pulls the trigger on that and says, okay, we need to get this out?
The National Weather Service.
That's from National
So
Weather.
National Weather Service, they push those things out. Now go ahead.
She's talking about the warning that we all got from Warren Central Texas, right? The one that
No,
we got on
I'm
our
not
phone?
Warren.
Oh, okay, never
Okay.
mind.
Okay.
It was KFC.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, when you see there's a tornado watch, a thunderstorm watch or warning, the triggers for all of that are all established by the National Weather Service, and they have an office in San Antonio, and they cover all of South and Central Texas, and they're watching everything, and they look like if they see the rotation in a cloud, and they have people who are just staring at their little screens, and if they see rotation, it's like, okay, now we're going from a watch to a warning because we see rotation.
I'm going to do the warning.
Yeah,
But Warren Central Texas, that's ideal because then you don't have to have your TV on. You'll actually get a phone call or a text right away, and it's based on the triggers from the National Weather Service.
Okay. Thank you.
Right?
all right.
Thank you.
so much.